Well, good morning. Welcome to Sunday school. Got the big hand on the 12 and the little hand on the 10, digitally, of course, up here. So we'll get started. I'm glad you made a choice to be here this morning. I know that in some families there's some issues that really have made that probably a challenge. But again, good morning to you. We are looking at Samson today. We're going to take a closer look at some of the lessons we can learn from his life. It's a character study, so a little bit different than what we've been doing. But there's some important things that we can learn and glean from his experience. So you see the outline that we'll follow through today. And Samson, I think the thing that I want to bring to your attention is, the Bible doesn't really clean all the characters up before it presents them to us. We get them as they are. And I think that's very telling, and it's very important for us to recognize. We're going to see the real Samson, and we'll have to, look seriously at him to see, God used him, but as we look at him, we're going to see that he was very flawed. And so as you begin to sort of put that together, how does that all work? Well, some pictures of some events in his life. The first one on the far left of the screen there is when his parents were worshiping as a result of the news that they were going to have a child. And if you read that passage in Judges 13, what I found interesting as I was going through there, or listening into it being read to me, I saw that, at one point where the angel just goes into the flame and goes up, there's a point there where he calls himself Wonderful. And as you begin to put together what the names of Jesus were, again, this is my imagination. I don't know that it was Jesus, or theophany as we might call it, but he calls himself Wonderful there. And we know that one of the names of Jesus is Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. So again, those things are important. And then we go to the middle image there. He wrestles with the lion as he's headed to Timnah. He's going to get married, and so he kills this lion with his bare hands, and then he has this wedding, and then on his way back to the wedding, in the far right side there, that he got some honey from the carcass of the lion, and it posed the riddle. But who was this man? Who was he? And why do we tell his story? I would venture to say, if we ask most of the children in the back about Samson, the key thing that they would remember about Samson, he was strong. He was strong. That's what we remember. And I think that that's good that we know that. But again, Samson had great strength, but he lacked wisdom. And in that, eventually, it brought about his downfall. And so we'll have to sort of sort through that together. And what do we see in his triumphs? And what do we see in his failures? There's another side to him, and the Bible doesn't hide it from us. And as you read through those chapters, 13 through 16, you begin to see this picture of a man who was the judge. And I think one of the last verses in Judges, chapter 21, verse 25, from the New Living Translation's on the screen there for you. In those days, Israel had no king, and all the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. So it plays into this idea, the dangers of your truth and my truth, instead of absolute truth. And so we see that play out in the book of Judges in many, many situations. Well, again, Judges 13, verse 5, for he will be dedicated. This is talking about Samson. The angel is talking about Samson and what his purpose is going to be. He'll be dedicated to God as a Nazirite from birth. He will begin to rescue Israel from the Philistines. So the message is strong. The message is straightforward. The message says there is a job for Samson to do. And so he's going to have to come to grips with that in one way or another. And we'll talk through that as we go. Well, again, before Samson was ever born, God had a purpose for his life. And I want you to let that sink in. Because the scriptures teach us that he knew us in our mother's womb. And all this, as we think about why we're here, why am I here? We all have a purpose. You know, Israel's path was marked by times of obedience and times followed by disobedience. And yet we find throughout that God was faithful to them. You know, ups and downs, ups and downs. And you might say, well, why in the world would God be faithful to them? Well, when they trusted and they followed him, good things happened for them. When they didn't, well, you know the rest of the story. I'm reminded of what Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2 tells me. It says, looking unto Jesus, the author and the finisher of our faith. You know, and it goes on in that verse to talk about the crucifixion, who he went forward with that. So again, this idea that we have a purpose and it's defined for us is important because, you know, a lot of times people go through life trying to figure out, what is my purpose? What's my calling? Well, purpose is defined on the screen there for you. It says it's the reason for which something is done or created. So we know the old song, Keep Your Eyes on Jesus, right? So when everything's sort of going haywire around you, you know, Samson had this unique gift. He had strength, didn't he? And God had a purpose for that gift. And it was going to be, remember verse 5, he would begin to deliver the Israelites from the Philistines. You know, we might say that he had a lot of potential. But the problem is, as we go through this, we're going to find that he really didn't live up to that potential. And, you know, you may look back at your life, or you may talk to your kids or your grandkids and say, hey, you know, you have so much potential. And we're trying to encourage them on to use that potential for good. And so here it is that Samson, he had so much potential. Well, where do we find the Israelites today? Verse 1, New Living Translation on the screen. Again, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. So the Lord handed them over to the Philistines, who oppressed them for 40 years. The story opens with the children of Israel in a very familiar place, unfortunately. Why? Because of their disobedience. They did not follow after the Lord. But during this time, you know, in the following verses, we find that an angelic messenger was sent to Manoah and his wife, and to tell them that they were going to have a child. Now, this couple was barren, and it was one of those things where, okay, a child's going to be a great thing, and that child was going to be used of God for a purpose. Again, getting to this idea of purpose. God's presence and God's power was going to be on this young man, and deliverance was going to be coming to them through Samson. Samson was going to be that messenger, that one that would do the tasking that was set before him. Well, notice the verses, Judges 13, verses 24 and 25. And it says this, when her son was born, she named him Samson, and the Lord blessed him as he grew up. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him while he lived in Manaah, and which is located between the towns of Zorah and Eshtaol. Well, life was routine for Manoah and his wife until a baby comes. You know, we all know that, have experienced that. If you've had children, life can be, you know, we're just going through the motions. Here we are, we're in life. And then all of a sudden, these children come along. Well, God's blessing was visible on Samson. It says so in the verses there. The Spirit of the Lord began to stir him. The Lord blessed him as he grew. You know, and as God is beginning to move on this young man, we might say that that's God's call for him to move toward his purpose. Now, there are folks in the room who have been called to preach, and they know that calling of God to something more, a purpose for them. And maybe others in the room, you don't really feel like God ever called you to do something, but you've been impressed. Maybe you sing, maybe you teach, maybe you encourage. You know, there's all sorts of things that people can do that God can impress upon you. Maybe you're that prayer warrior. You know, maybe all these things are maybes, but only you will know how God is leading you and how God is directing you. Well, it was evident that the Spirit of the Lord was stirring Samson, and it's so evident that it's written down for us. You know, God has a purpose for our lives. You know, and many times people struggle with that. And I would say to you, whatever he calls you to do, he will equip you to do. So just be aware of that. It's not that you have to figure this out for yourself. Look at what happened with Samson. God worked and stirred him toward what he wanted him to do. Well, what is life lesson number one from us from Samson's life? God has a purpose for every life. So we need to find the purpose God has for me and you and use the gifts that he's given us to serve him. I know some of you will go to popular culture for a moment here. Some of you know the movie Forrest Gump. You know that movie. And the main character is played by Tom Hanks, and, the movie goes along. And he's in a scene where he's asking his mother, who is dying, saying, "What's my purpose, Mama?" And that's where the infamous box of chocolates comes around. But what's my purpose? Everyone wants to know what their purpose in life is. And we all have been called to a purpose. Now, how does this play out? Samson's parents taught him, didn't they? And that's key, isn't it? Because we are passing the faith to the next generation. So we all have a purpose. We need to make sure that we're doing just that. We're teaching them. We need to teach our children to look for God's plan for their life. In other words, I can't convey to you what, I could never have predicted what my children would do. But God has a plan for them. And I need to make sure that I've trained them. So within each of us is this desire to fulfill a purpose. And how do we get to know what it is? Well, in Samson's case, again, it is about the fact that his parents taught him the ways of God. Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 6 from the King James, you know this verse. It starts out with, "Train up a child in the way he should go." So again, we have some responsibility in that as parents to teach. And as we teach, God moves. And we see that in the life of Samson. Well, next event that happens in Samson's life, there we go. He used a ruined marriage to engage the Philistines. We find this in Judges 14 and 15. Samson, the man, saw a Philistine woman and decided this was who he would marry. This is what I want. You know how kids are, right? I want it now. This is what I want. This is how I want it. Just tee it up for me. Well, again, his parents tried to dissuade him. Notice this. When he returned home, he told his father and mother, "A young Philistine woman in Timnah caught my eye. I want to marry her. Get her for me." Well, again, if you have children, you know how this story can end. His parents, they tried to discourage him, and yet this was all part of God's plan. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? Because how could this be part of God's plan? Well, as we know, children, this was a bad choice, period. Samson, this is a bad choice for you. And the Bible shows us a lot of these types of, choices that people make, and they don't always go very well. Well, this one's not going to be an exception to that. This is a bad choice. Children often go their own way, and most of us who are parents can attest to that. We can train them, we can teach them, but yet they have what we call free will. They can go their own way and do their own thing. But we can learn from this situation and not make sort of the same mistakes, because as you think about Samson, what was he doing? He was veering away from the things that he'd been taught as a child. He was an Israelite. He was a judge. And, why are you veering away from the things that you've been taught? Some of you, your parents, your grandparents taught you the ways of God, and you might have in your own experience, you veered away from the things that you were taught, and you found your way back, and it was very important that you did. And so, because it's not a good thing to go your own way. Well, life lesson number 2 is this. God is at work to do what? To accomplish his purposes even when we don't recognize it. Now, I like what I find here in Judges chapter 14, verse 17. Again, New Living Translation. So she cried. Now, this is after, Samson has married this woman, and, they're having this feast and celebration. The wedding was a week-long celebration. Samson had posed a riddle to the Philistines, and his new bride, they were there, and she was just all tore up that he would not share the answer to the riddle with her. And she cried whenever she was with him and kept it up for the rest of the celebration. Now, it doesn't seem like that's much of a celebration, does it? Here you've married a woman, and all of a sudden all she's doing is crying and crying. And at last, on the seventh day, he told her the answer because she was tormenting him with her nagging. Then she explained the riddle to the young men. So what she did is she persuaded him to change. And this just goes to show you got to be careful, don't you? And the choices that you make, especially the life choices. So, he finally tells her, and, at one point in the scriptures, he says, hey, why would I tell you? I didn't even tell my parents. So it was like a big secret, but she just kept on and kept on and kept on until he finally gave in. Well, Proverbs has some advice about this. We find in Proverbs chapter 21 and verse 9, and it says this from the New Living Translation, it's better to live alone in the corner of an attic than with a quarrelsome wife in a lovely house. So there you go, guys. That's some scriptural advice for you. And if you're married already, it's too bad, dude. You're going to have to live with that. So anyway, so Samson posed the riddle to the Philistines that were there, and it was all about getting 30 changes of clothes. And, if you don't know the riddle, you've got to give me 30 changes of clothes. If you guess the riddle, I'll give you 30 changes of clothes. That's what was going to happen. And so what happened with the Philistines? They go to this new bride and they say, why did you invite us here to make us poor, take away our wealth? Well, he gave in, told her, she told them, they guessed the riddle. What do you think Samson did? Well, he got mad. Samson reacted. He was angry about this. We know Samson's, he's really, he's trying to do the right thing, maybe, but his example to us tells us that he wasn't really following God's plans because he's marrying a woman of the Philistines down near Timnah. Well, the result, the 30 Philistines were going to be killed. So Samson got mad, he leaves, he goes finds 30 men, Philistines, kills them, takes their clothes, brings them back, gives them to these guys, and then he takes off. He goes home. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because he's got a wife here. There's still a wedding feast of sorts, if you can call that a feast. But, Samson left the wedding, tends to this, and what happens next would even bring more judgment on the Philistines. So again, God is working to judge the Philistines. It's happening at the hands of Samson. Well, so his wife was given in marriage. Now this father, you got to say, wow, this guy was like, Samson left. It's a wedding celebration. What am I going to do? I'm going to give the bride to the best man. Whoa. Again, at that time, we know how women were treated as property. But again, this whole concept, as you read through it, becomes, wow, how can this possibly be? His wife was given in marriage to the man who had been Samson's best man at the wedding, Judges 14 and 20. Samson definitely had an anger issue, didn't he? He just flew into a rage. And then he went and took advantage of these men who probably had nothing. They weren't at the wedding. Why are you coming? Why are you coming into our town? And more importantly, he killed 30 men for their clothes. Why did he do it? Why did he do it? It was personal revenge, wasn't it? Personal revenge. Because now his wife has been given to the best man. He finally, I don't know if he came to his senses or what, the scriptures don't say, but he goes back to the place where he was married and he says to the father, bring me my bride. I'm not bringing her to you. I gave her to the best man. Now, can you imagine that conversation? Wow. So Samson gets mad again. And we're told from the scriptures that he goes out and he gets these foxes and he ties them together, and sets them loose in the fields. Sets them on fire first, sets the cord on fire, and sets them loose in the field. Well, what happened? You have it on the screen there, Judges 15 and 5. He burned all their grain to the ground, including the sheaves and the uncut grain. He also destroyed their vineyards and olive gardens, or olive groves. He comes back to claim his bride and learns what the father had done, gets mad. He reacts again, punish the Philistines for what they had done to him. Interesting. Now, what happens after this is that this action sets up this pursuit that was going to ultimately cost Samson his freedom and eventually his life. This time was going to be different. This time would be different. This time he would be pursued and captured. And unfortunately, it led to the death of his bride and her husband, and her father. They were killed by the Philistines because they wanted to know where he was. And he had hidden himself in a cave, and so what happens? Well, the people of Judah are like, wait a minute, time out. This is not a good situation that you've got us into. Judges 15:11 tells me this: 3,000 men of Judah went down to get Samson at the cave in the rock of Adam. And they said to Samson, "Don't you realize the Philistines rule over us? What are you doing to us? In other words, why are you dragging us into this? This is your fight. This is not our fight." But they got involved. But look at his response. This tells me that Samson was so self-centered. I only did to them what they did to me. It's sort of one of those gotcha kind of things. It's familiar in a way, isn't it? Ever heard your kids say, well, they started it? Maybe you said it as a child. They started it. I didn't start this. They started it. Well, again, interesting, isn't it? Because Samson was destined to deliver Israel from the Philistines, and yet getting to that purpose required some strange events to occur. Back to his purpose, the passage told us that he would begin. Now, that was an important word. He would begin to deliver the Israelites, the children of Israel. Well, where does it take us? It takes us to this idea that God used Samson's capture to destroy the Philistines. So it's important for you to know. So the men of Judah went there. They went to the cave, 3,000 of them. Here is Samson in there, and he's like, okay, well, all right, fine. I'll go with you, but please tell me you won't kill me, until we get there, So they bound him up and they took him to the Philistines. Well, interestingly enough, in Judges 15:20, it tells us how long Samson was a judge. Remember, they didn't have a king, and so everyone did that which was right in their own eyes. Judges 21:25. Here we find out that Samson judged Israel for 20 years during the period when the Philistines dominated the land. So the events that we were shown, they're just a small part of Samson's life. So as we're hitting on some of these things that I'm sharing with you, they're just a small part of this 20-year experience. And yet God was going to use him in spite of himself. And it's interesting. He had issues. We would say he had issues. Well, what's the next lesson we can learn from his life? It is that sexual sin is an especially harmful temptation. Again, it's about choices, isn't it? Samson made a series of choices that compromised his leadership. Remember that Samson was a Nazirite from his birth. There were certain requirements related to that vow, and yet somehow he drifted away from that calling. One day Samson went to the Philistine town of Gaza and spent the night with a prostitute. Well, again, we see, so he leaves his first wife, goes back, gets mad because of, the father had given the wife to the best man. Then he goes, finds himself with a prostitute. And so not only does this not seem to matter to Samson, because he's doing his own thing. He really is. Now, when the Philistines learned that he was there in Gaza, they surrounded the place where he was. And they thought, well, we've got him now. When he comes out in the morning, the gates of the city are closed. We'll take him, we'll kill him. And, I would say to you that for Samson, women and sexual sin was a serious temptation for him. Well, in this instance, he gets up at midnight. I'll show them. Gets up at midnight, leaves, takes the gates of the city out of the ground and carries them with him and leaves. Now, I don't know how the Philistines didn't hear him doing this. I won't try to figure that out. But this is what he did. And then there is the story of Delilah. Most of us know the story of Delilah. She was flirtatious. She just drew him in. Again, her occupation wasn't a good one. And so here we are, Proverbs chapter 7 speaks to this, doesn't it? And it talks to the dangers for the young man related to the adulterous woman. So these challenges are quite real. And so here we go. Samson's going to throw everything away for this one moment. And we might say, again, that he was self-absorbed. It was all about him, his pleasure, his timing, his life, what he wanted. Maybe some of you have met people like that. It's all about them. It wouldn't matter what you said. It's all about them. Well, this encounter was all about Samson's pleasure and about his satisfaction, but little did he know she was going to betray him into the hands of the Philistines. Okay, Samson, you're here, but they offered me $1,100 pieces of silver each to betray you. Well, where does this take me? It takes me to this idea that I need to walk with God in the power of his Spirit. So the once mighty Samson had been humbled and defeated. God's Spirit had left him. He'd finally, gone too far. And the sad thing is he didn't realize that the Spirit of God had left him. I don't know how Delilah got his head shaved while he was asleep, but it happened. And so when he heard the call that the Philistines are on you, and he got up to try to battle as he had done before, he wasn't able to. He wasn't able to. And so the Philistines, they mock him, and they captured him, and they gouged out his eyes. Again, if you read the book of Judges, you read it all, there's some pretty gruesome stuff in there. But he was focused on self. And recall the Bible's clarity about sin. It says this: there is pleasure in sin. What's the rest? For a season. For a season. Samson was captured. So I'm not going to stand here and tell you that, he wasn't enjoying life, because the Bible says there can be some pleasure in that. Samson was captured. His strength was gone. What happened to him? He became a slave. He was grinding corn. Can you imagine? Well, life lesson number 5 from him is that our sinful and unwise decisions cause us to miss God's very best for us. But God can still use us to accomplish his purposes. His life was plagued with bad choices and bad behaviors. He was self-centered. It was marked by anger and revenge, adultery. All these things were a part of Samson's life. His disobedience had consequences. The children of Israel went through the cycle of this being obedient, drifting, and then suffering the consequences of disobedience. In this story, it's truly personal. He was reaping what he sowed. Think about that for a moment. Just let that sink in. Well, God sometimes uses flawed people for his greater purposes, and I'm glad for that, because I'm a flawed person, and so God can still use us. We are called to serve, and we've been equipped for our purpose, and in the end, God's purposes were achieved through a flawed person here. There was still hope. Why is God faithful, and why would God use this man, Samson? Well, you know the end of the story, right? He killed more people in his death than he had during his life. And we have a record of about 1,030 or so that he had killed while he was alive. And so Samson said, they brought him out to mock him. And this is where sin can take you. They brought him out to mock him. They were having a big celebration to Dagon, their god. And so they brought him out. Let's bring Samson out. Let's show what happened. Well, the Philistines forgot that the hair was growing, and they needed to make sure that wasn't there. And so, here we are. What's going to happen next? Well, Samson tells the young man to help him get between the pillars that were there. And I like what I find in Judges chapter 16, verse 28. Such an important verse. Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, remember me again. Please strengthen me just one more time." He repented. Interesting, isn't it? This prayer of repentance. He recognized where he had where he had drifted from. And he wanted to come back. Now, the last part of the verse, is still about Samson, isn't it? With one blow, let me pay back the Philistines for the loss of my 2 eyes. In other words, he wanted revenge still. But he prayed. He wanted and needed God's help. Can I say to you in your life, wherever you are in life, wherever you are in your journey, you always need God's help. That first 2 lines, that's a good prayer. Very good prayer. Samson had been broken, and I like the last verse on the screen there, Psalm 51:17. It says this, the sacrifice you desire is a broken spirit. And this is talking about God will not reject a broken and repentant heart. There was still hope for Samson even at this stage. There was still hope because he was broken and he looked to God for strength. God hears the brokenhearted and he responds. What happened? Samson, his strength came back. He pushed the pillars out. And that day, at the celebration of Dagon, the god of the Philistines, God demonstrated his power, that he is still in control. Well, I'm out of time this morning. Next up for us is unity in the church, 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Let's stand and go to prayer this morning. Heavenly Father, we come to you this morning. We thank you for the lessons we can learn from the Scriptures. And we thank you for how timely they are and how they can be applied to every generation, Lord. As our church ministers to children, Lord, help us to teach them the ways of the Lord. Lord, I pray right now that you'd be with us in a special way today. For those who may be grieving, Lord, be with them. For those who have sad hearts, lift them up, I pray. Lord, I ask right now that you be with those maybe who are sick and can't be here, those who have physical needs or spiritual needs, financial needs, whatever those needs might be. You know where we are. You know what we have need of. You can lift us up, and we are so grateful for that. I pray that you be with us in the worship service this morning. Lord, I see that we have guests that will be singing soon. Lord, I just pray that you'd bless them in a special way. Use them and use their talent to be a praise and worship to you. And Lord, I pray for the pastor as he preaches today. Use him in a special way. We love you, give you praise for all things because you